Once Chris Key gets his meeting started.
Great. Okay. Welcome, everybody, or welcome back. We are in the Finance and Compliance Committee portion of today's agenda. I think you don't have any comments, do you? All right. Then I am going, you've kind of been hijacking the meeting all day, but I'm kidding. What is happening with this thing? You can't, my foot keeps touching it. Yes, I just snorted there, so Pullman Radio might want to capture that too. I'm going to turn it over to Regent Shower, who will be leading us as the chair of this committee.
Thank you. This is my first committee of the whole, so appreciate everyone being here today. We had a great pre-meeting and excited with some of the news that'll be shared today. So I think we'll go ahead and get started here first. So Heather Lopez, who is our Chief Audit Executive, is going to come on up and go through. Hopefully everyone had a chance to read the annual audit report. I know I did, printed it, brought it with me, highlighted it. Go ahead, Heather.
All right, thank you. All right, so just a reminder, I'm now reporting to the committee 2 times a year instead of 4 times a year. So what you have in your packet today is an annual report that includes a number of attachments on activities that occurred in fiscal year 2021. Internal audit, just a reminder, we are now 5 auditors, including myself, and we provide audit services statewide across the entire university system. That has always been, even before WSU, we've always been basically a system office. And we touch on any WSU operations. Our services include audit, obviously, investigation, advisory and consulting activities. In that bucket, we used to include ethics advice. I was the ethics advisor for the university. And the first item in your packet as an enclosure is a change to the charter, the internal audit charter. I discussed it at the last report that there's been a change in that duty. I no longer take on ethics advice for the university and the liaison with the ethics board, except in the role of investigations. I still do the investigation part, but not the guidance to individual employees. The university has hired a new ethics advisor. This is a brand new dedicated role that reports to the chief compliance officer, who reports up into Vice President Pearson's group. And that's been a great transition, by the way. We do work together very closely as she's getting used to her role, and I anticipate we'll continue to work together closely. We do investigations, misconduct, a lot of like ethics abuse, that kind of thing. We need to make sure that we're on the same page, and we'll continue to have a really good relationship in that way. We also provide liaison services with external auditors and investigators, and some of the attachments in here are related to some external audits that I'll touch on at the end here. So another highlight that I touched on at our last report is really over the last 2 years, besides everybody dealing with COVID and the new work environment, there was a significant uptick in external audit inquiry and investigations. And it actually started before COVID emerged. And there's several reasons leading to that, but when there's an external audit, we are the liaison for external auditors on most audits except for financial statement audit. That's with the controller's office in finance. With external audits, sometimes they're a touch and go, like desk reviews. They'll come in and be out real quick. They're post activity, just asking for support for things that were reported. The last couple of years, the external audits, especially once COVID emerged, they were very extensive. Part of it, we think, is they were also working remotely, so they didn't have that travel, and they had more time to work on audit in their own setting instead of having to take the time to come out. and just new requirements in various areas that required a deeper dive on some of the audits, which you'll see in some of these reports. There has been a wind down in external audits. So looking at up to today, in the last 6 months, we've only had 2 new external audit inquiries, which is terrific obviously for our office and liaison, but really it's a huge lift for departments when there's an external audit. They're called on, especially in the central departments like sponsored programs, in Office of Research and the units for federal audits, the actual PI and their research administrative group. They're tasked with pulling all those records, sometimes going back 4, 5, 6 years. And it can be a huge lift. So hopefully saving some time. The other crunch that has made it pretty difficult in the last couple of years with this uptick has been the transition to Workday. A lot of folks learning this new system and then dealing with the requests. And really everybody that we worked with throughout the last year on the external audits and on the internal audit were terrific, responsive, even with all of the heavy lift that they were doing on Workday and all their normal everyday duties, to make sure that we address the external audit inquiries and the internal audit requests. So talked about item 1, the charter. The second item is the planned audit report that I've included in my packet. It's on an audit of salary cap. Just a little bit background, uniform guidance they have limits on how much you can charge on salary on federal programs. The sponsor that's the most restrictive is NIH. So there's a cap on how much cannot go over for PIs. Or for anybody charged on the grant. Probably about 5 or 6 years ago, we maybe had 4, 5, 6 employees, PIs across the university system that had salaries that were at a point that you would have to take a look and make sure that we didn't exceed that. But we have a lot more now in the last several years, and especially with the growing and success of getting grants on health sciences campus. There's quite a few on that campus. There are in some other colleges on some of the other campuses, but mostly up in Spokane, there's quite a few that are up in that higher salary range that invokes those requirements that would require more active monitoring to make sure that we're not over the salary cap. So a few years ago in 2019, there was a management review. It was done by Sponsored Programs, Finance, and Spokane campus. And they did a deep dive and they looked at all of the charges on all the awards for one PI. And they did find that there were overcharges. And while they were working on that, it was brought to our attention and we added it into our audit plan. Let's look at it university-wide. That was just one PI. Let's see how many others. So we had that engagement planned, and then we had inquiry from external parties that wanted to look at the same thing. So it was a little bit unusual situation. We're doing an internal audit with the objective to evaluate the controls. Are we adequately monitoring that we are in compliance? And if we're out of compliance, how much? Usually for an audit, you're not doing 100%, you're taking a selective sample of your population. With the external audit inquiry going on at the same time, we did expand that on their request. And so it covered a 6-year period, and it was pretty much 100% system-wide. So in the end, did find that there were overcharges. We knew there would be, we just didn't know how much. There's a need for improvement to internal controls. Most of those have already been put in place. Management has implemented additional notices, training with Workday and the modernization group. They've been working very hard on developing reports that will help enable monitoring better. So all of these things are in place. I think we're probably looking pretty good going in the future, but we still had to address those past issues. And so with an overcharge, there's a requirement to refund the federal government. Half of that has already been done, and the other is being worked out right now. So that was the gist of that particular audit. It was a heavy lift for not just our office, but definitely for sponsor programs in the units. There were 10 areas, 10 colleges that were impacted on this, and their grants offices did a terrific job, even with Workday transition, trying to make sure that we had all the support, did the calculations, got everything to identify truly what were the overcharges and make sure that they were accurate. Any questions on that report, that audit? Okay. So another takeaway just on that particular audit that I wanted to mention. So my job is also to report to the committee on controls, governance, at the university. And one of the things from this, because the reason I mentioned 5-6 years ago, we may not have seen so many PIs with high salaries like this, things change. As we expand our research enterprise and we take on more programs and schools and so on as we grow. There's new compliance requirements every single day. There's a constant need to assess and see if there's anything else that might be impacting us. So our takeaway, we're working with we're starting with the health sciences campus and looking at specific risks in the research environment for the type of activity that they engage in. And hopefully we'll head off some of these, in an audit, yes, an internal audit, but hopefully not an external audit, which can be a little bit more painful. Summary of 2 other areas before I get to the attachments. Yes.
Sorry, I might have missed it, but of the 549,000 overcharges, what was the reason? And just a lack of awareness, or besides no controls? I mean, how do you ensure people are aware of why that happened?
Part of that is, so there was a report in there that the controls needed to be improved.
Yeah.
And these are controls at central and for monitoring and also at the department level. Some units were aware of salary cap limitations. The PIs certainly should be aware that there are limits, but the tools that were available to them at the time were not adequate to easily identify and monitor for that. Okay. Also, the university did not have a university-wide policy on salary cap until July 2020, which was basically the end of the period that we were looking at. We looked at the 6 years prior to that. So some of the units that were doing salary cap, they recognized that they had over limit. The way they were doing their calculations was, it was across the board different everywhere and not always correct. So lack of awareness, lack of guidance, and the tools to do so. And that's what we were focusing on, and improvement in controls. And that's definitely better in play now.
Thanks.
So another area that we perform some services investigations in fiscal year 20, we had a huge number that we were reporting on, but in the last year we had quite a decline in the number of complaints that came in that actually resulted in an investigation or an inquiry. Might be because a large part of the workforce was working remote through the majority of the year, but we continue to, like I said, work with the ethics advisor. That's where we see a lot of inquiries that come in when they get more guidance, when they get more training, they understand, oh, this might not be right. And then we start getting the calls. But we did have a decrease in the number of complaints, and none of our cases would rise to the level of what we would classify as fraud. There was misuse of resource, but most of the things were pretty minor transgressions. We also do follow-up of audits and investigations that yield an audit report and recommendations. Again, both audits and investigations. We have a few, almost anytime we do a full investigation, we have a separate memo that goes to management on what happened, what was the breakdown, how did this occur, and we provide recommendations on reviewing that area to improve it, to limit it occurring again. For audits, same thing, we do follow up on our audits. I have in your report a summary of a number of the outstanding audits. We do still have a number of the IT audits that have outstanding issues, and broke them down a little bit differently this year from last year. Instead of just like bulleting them, giving you a little bit of a background on what was the real issue. Most of the issues on a lot of the outstanding IT issues are administrative in nature, developing a policy, the guidelines, the minimum standards that units and IT folks need to follow, and implementing them. That's the second part, operational. Now, at the end of this year, we're making progress. We have a dedicated effort in our office with our IT auditor working with the IT team. There's monthly meeting to sit down and talk about the outstanding issues and what progress they're making, what they've implemented. Some of those IT issues are so dated, they're before Workday and they're related to the legacy system. So initially you would think, well, they're obsolete. We can just write them off. We work with management because sometimes we don't quite agree. There's some controls related to some of those issues like access. If we had an issue with access to the legacy system, do we still have that same issue, the oversight, the monitoring, the policies related to it going into the new system? And before we mark them off as resolved, we want to make sure that the improved controls are in place. A number of the outstanding recommendations you'll see this year are more at the distributed areas than central. And that's a good sign. That means central's made a lot of progress in implementing the outstanding issues, improving their controls. And now it needs to get out to those distributed areas, the colleges and campuses. They needed those guidelines. They needed to know what were the minimum standards that were expected for configuration of their systems or for access controls or whatever the area was. And now we're working with those distributed areas to look at their implementation. Questions?
Thank you very much, Heather. One of the areas that we had talked a little bit about was the IT compliance and the audit results. And I appreciated how you put this together so that it's easy to see which areas need some more work. Any questions of Heather?
Heather Redmond here. Always good to see another Heather. Hi, Heather. Great work as usual. I just wanted to mention that, we have been really focused on this IT piece for a while, and I am disappointed to see that we haven't gotten all of the old stuff cleared out. So I'm hoping that we can just sort of put a laser focus on that and at least get the legacy things covered and off our plate.
Thank you. And I can address on the legacy issues where I mentioned we have some outstanding that are related to legacy. We did work with Vice President Play's group, and it was a lot of exchange going back and forth and getting to a comfort level within our office. But related to some of the outstanding on the legacy, management has accepted the risk. We had that documented in writing. Not only accepting the risk, but identifying what that risk is and what mitigating controls are in place. And so part of the process, I think it was most of last year going through this process and the back and forth, making sure that those mitigating controls were in place to really reduce that risk. And even though we are into a new financial personnel system, the mainframe, the mitigating controls, they did carry over. So we accepted management's acceptance of particular risks on the legacy system. I think there may only be 2 or 3 left related to legacy.
Thank you.
And yes, we'll continue working with them.
Good.
All right. So the last areas was on liaison services, and that's related to the last couple of attachments that I have in the report. The item 3 and 4, they kind of look the same. They're both related to the SAO, State Auditor's Office Accountability Audit. They audit that particular audit every 2 years. This one was fiscal year 18 and 19. So we're talking several years ago, and it was pretty broad. They took advantage of the remote work environment to make a lot of requests for records and test selections across a large area because they didn't have to be here on campus. Overall, that was a pretty good audit. I mean, it was extensive, but good results, minor recommendations. The reports are included on their website. The accountability report is, and the exit report is in your packet, so you can see what the recommendations are, but again, pretty minor. Another state auditor's office audit was the single audit, statewide single audit. WSU gets this audit. We get this audit every 2 years usually. And it's just the level of expenditure at WSU doesn't rise compared to like Department of Transportation or UW or some other places that have a much higher level of spend. They may get an audit every year, a single audit. WSU has been pretty much on a schedule of every other year. And our biggest spend is in student financial aid cluster. And so we are almost guaranteed to have every other year that program audited. For fiscal year 20, it was extensive. I did single audit back when I was a state auditor many years ago, and then in this liaison role at WSU for 16 years. And this last year was just incredibly broad and deep. And the auditors were auditing based on what Department of Ed had requested and required. And they were actively engaged in audit activity and requests basically from August through March, full time. So it was pretty deep. We did, as a university, get a finding on this. This first finding that I know of in at least 20 years on single audit. And it was audited as part of the student financial aid cluster, but it wasn't related to specifically to like the disbursement of loans or in financial services itself. It was tangentially, it was related to the information security controls, the IT controls. So it's called GLBA, Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. That is a provision that wants to ensure that we have appropriate safeguards over information security specific to data for student data. And so they audited in that area. They did acknowledge in the finding that the university had controls to safeguard information, but they didn't test those controls, so they couldn't opine on them. The finding was specific to the lack of an information risk assessment on information security. And you need a risk assessment to identify which controls you should have. Don't spend all this time and money and effort on just putting in controls because that's what you've always done. You really need to do a risk assessment to identify where those risks are so that you can more strategically deploy your assets. And that was what was missing. And it was not just in financial aid, it was also university-wide from central IT that they were looking for guidance from that area. So the audit report actually identified the individual responsible for information security at the university, and that's the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. What a finding means is a lot of work. They come back. It's not in every other year. They're back. They're already planning right now for another round of testing in November and December, and they're doing a repeat of the whole audit that they did last year. Also a focus on a deep dive on the resolution of the issues that were identified in the finding. There is an active group university-wide that is working on that, on resolution of that issue that was reported in the finding. They're very engaged in meeting at least monthly to roll out information security risk assessment, not just for student data, but university-wide information systems. So we'll cover a lot broader areas as needed.
Heather, were you anticipating that finding? Did that come as a surprise? Were you kind of thinking, was it nagging at you? Like, where was that in the overall outcome?
Yeah, so we knew it would be an issue. So our office, when we do our annual risk assessment, we look at industry trends and changes, dear colleague letters from sponsors. And we saw that GLBA was an area that they were going to pick up for single audit. We included it in our audit plan. We started in on the audit, and with COVID and other interruptions, we got as far as planning. And then the auditor showed up and they were ready to start. So we knew from our planning already that there was not a documented risk assessment. So kind of stop. And what we were surprised about was not the issue. We knew that that was lacking. We were surprised that it was at the level of a finding. We fought pretty hard. I mean, it was earned that it was an issue and it needs to be addressed. We were just surprised that it was at that level. And UW also received the same word for word issue. Other institutions that were also up for single audit this year of their financial aid, same thing. There were very few that did not get it to that level of reporting. Department of Ed was really particular on what they were looking for in that area. And if you didn't have it, finding. And that is it for my report. I'll take any other questions.
When do we see you here again?
I think it's at the March.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Regent Redmond, any more questions from you?
No, thank you.
Okay. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks, Heather. All right. Next up, we have fiscal year 2022 integrated financial forecast. And this will be presented by Matt Skinner, Senior Associate Vice President, Finance and Administration, and Kelly Westhoff, Executive Director, Budget Planning and Analysis, while Miss Stacy is out on vacation. So Matt, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Regent Shower. Good afternoon, Board of Regents. It's an honor to be here representing Stacy this afternoon. That's a heavy responsibility. We'll do our best to do that today. I want to just recognize Kelly Westhoff, introduce her. She leads our Office of Budget Planning Analysis. Grateful to have Kelly here today to help with this presentation. She'll do most of the presenting. I'll just give maybe some introductory words here. Reminder, this integrated financial forecast and planning is something we started about a year ago to try to look more holistically across WSU at our key financial activities, get a high level sense for what the trends there were, to get a better picture of what our financial condition was, both in the near term. This has been very beneficial through the pandemic. I'm really glad we had this tool in place. And then longer term, it's going to be helpful for us as we look for strategic opportunities to grow the university. So Kelly, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be here today. As Matt mentioned, we're coming off the bench for Stacy, so I hope you'll give us some grace with that. This will be my first time with you presenting. So as we get into our item, we'd like to do a little bit of a timeline that just includes some of the financial activities that we have endured over the last 18 months as we've been dealing with the pandemic. So by now, we're all really familiar with that date. March of 2020 is when the pandemic started. And in April of 2020, we learned of our first round of federal funding that was going to be available to WSU. That was the CARES Act. And then in June of 2020, there was the first briefing for the Regents about the impacts of the pandemic. So at this point, we were just trying to get our arms around the risks that were inherent in the pandemic and some of the mitigating actions that we could take to deal with those. So what we had learned by that point was that nearly every revenue stream at the university was going to be jeopardized in some way due to the pandemic. So we had realized, because of the state economy that essentially shut down with the pandemic, that our appropriations would be in danger. We weren't sure about student enrollment, of course, because we didn't know if we would be on campus last year. We knew that international students would be a challenge because of travel restrictions. And then, of course, our auxiliary activities like housing, dining, there was considerable concern there around enrollment as well, because if students aren't on campus, we didn't know if we would need to do single occupancy in dorms or if we would have any occupancy, frankly. Also concerns, of course, with athletics, with the canceled seasons in the spring and then going into fall, whether we'd have fans in the stands, media revenue, all of those streams being threatened. And then finally, even at the onset of the pandemic, when there was such a great spike in unemployment, we were thinking, well, that's going to threaten philanthropy, and maybe even, folks' capacity to give is going to be threatened as well. So on the revenue side, considerable risks, I would say. And so immediately, of course, we start to consider how can we mitigate those risks and what are some of the actions we might consider. So one of the early actions, and Actually, ahead of the governor, President Schultz implemented a hiring freeze, a salary freeze. When we looked beyond that, even to potential furloughs or salary reductions across the board for staff. Other things that we considered, of course, were just other spending, savings and spending. It was clear that without folks on campus, we were saving lots of money on travel. And we also thought, without folks here, we could have some savings in utilities. So we were thinking about what kind of savings might be inherent in the quarantine situation. We also looked at things like our reserves, did some analysis of what we might take advantage of in our savings, if you will, on a short-term basis. Consider debt restructuring because of actually historically low interest rates. And then we were also exploring, aside from the CARES funds, other opportunities for funding like FEMA or state emergency funds. So lots of activity, just trying to get our arms around the impacts. So by August of 2020, we had submitted our 21-23 biennial budget request to the state. That request actually included about an $80 million mandatory reduction to our appropriation that was required of all state agencies for the 21-23 biennium, and that's obviously because of the state economy and what had happened since the onset of the pandemic. So in response, internally, WSU areas prepared 3-year plans, assuming a 10% reduction in their core funds, which would include state appropriation. And then for areas that weren't funded through those core funds, they were also projecting for a 3-year period what the impacts of the COVID pandemic might be on their operations. And then in September, that was the first introduction of the integrated financial plan to the Regents. And just as I've spoke about all the different revenue streams that were impacted by the pandemic, that's what really made it obvious that we needed to take a more holistic approach and start thinking about our financial planning in an all funds and an all-inclusive way. So over the winter, then we learned of 2 different additional federal packages that would become available to us. So that included the CRISA Act, which was signed in December of 2020, and then the ARPA Act that was signed in March of 2021. Both of those provided additional institutional aid for us that can be used to help offset COVID expenses or lost revenues, and then also significant funds for direct aid to students. So a number of things happened in the spring, and this timeline kind of talks about those that helped us prepare for our FY22 planning. So in April, we are notified from OFM what the maximum increase in our resident undergraduate tuition will be. So essentially, tuition rates are set by the legislature for resident undergraduates. So we have to learn from OFM. It's a 14-year index that actually gets calculated annually. So we get notification of that rate in the spring. And then that formulates a recommendation that we bring to the Regents, which was approved in May of last year. The rate that we could have increased tuition was 2.8. That was the approved amount. We actually approved a 2.5% increase last year. Then later on in May, the governor signed the budget bill. The great good news headline of that was that our appropriation was not reduced. When we did our biennial budget, we were required to do that giant reduction of almost 80 million, but because of an improved state economy, that didn't actually come to fruition. So that was a great good news. So with all of those pieces of information now, we knew what our tuition rate increase would be, and we also now knew what our appropriation would be. That gave us a good basis to start planning for FY22. And we knew by this point in the spring that enrollment was trending down pretty much system-wide. So we began to look at those 3 factors together and made adjustments to the unit budgets. So if you'll recall, we did as I mentioned, we did a 3-year 10% reduction. Based on our analysis this spring, we were able to restore some of that 10% reduction for FY22, so that we're actually looking at 7.5% reductions for FY22. Then just last month, we held budget hearings where each unit leader, that would be chancellors, vice presidents, and deans, were able to present about how they would strategically use the 2.5% of restored funding for their area. Also challenges associated with the 7.5% continuing reduction. And then each area also presented to us about their COVID-19 costs or lost revenues that were encountered from the beginning of the pandemic through current date. After the budget hearings, then an executive committee met, and we actually had a few adjustments to some of the reduction targets to meet the most urgent needs that would help with being back in the classroom this fall and also contribute to student success. So that brings us to today's meeting and our update on the forecast for our early forecast for FY22. So again, for the core funds of the university, the core funds are about 50% of our operating budget, comprised of state appropriation and tuition. Most generally, there are also a couple of smaller local funds that are included in core funds, like administrative fees, interest, and indirect cost returns on grants. So as I mentioned, our state appropriation survived intact, which was a great bit of news, but enrollment is trending down system-wide, and we have adjusted unit budgets accordingly through that 7.5% reduction. The budget hearings resulted in some targeted reinvestment to align with the budget principles that are stated there, which was to support high-quality academic delivery and student success, sustain jobs, and maintain a focus on revenue generation where possible. We continue to consider the best use of our federal relief funding. It's going to be an important source to help us kind of balance things out over the next few years. We, as I mentioned at the hearings, collected information on the costs and lost revenues to date, and those were double the amount of funding that we have available in federal funds. So we are doing continued analysis of the best strategic use. We can actually use those funds not only this fiscal year, but they can move into next fiscal year as well. So the timing will be important too. And with that, I think I will turn over to Matt for that last slide.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kelly. So two other big components of integrating our revenue sources together is looking at housing and dining student auxiliaries on the Pullman campus. As you can imagine, the impact to those units during fiscal year 21 was significant with the move to remote learning. They will finish last fiscal year with about a $21 million loss. So we're working closely. They've done a good job preparing for this year, in my opinion, really managing expenses the best they can while providing services to our students. Occupancy is recovering, which is great. Original forecast at about 4,400 students to be in the residence halls on the Pullman campus. That's trending up a little bit now after the first couple weeks of class at about 4,700, which is outstanding, which would put them at about $5 to $6 million positive net for fiscal year 22, which is wonderful. They do have bond covenants in place for housing and dining that requires that they have positive net income, so that's really good news. We continue to work really closely with Ellen and the leadership team and student affairs to monitor that and keep it moving along. Athletics is also an important part of this, and we actually have a separate action or information item on that Regent shower that we could discuss after this presentation that would tie into that. So that's our quick update on integrated financial plan. We're going to continue to monitor things really closely over the next couple months and then be back to let the board know how things are playing out here for fiscal year 22.
Are there any questions or comments?
I have one, Lisa. Matt and Kelly, if you all could talk a little bit about the improved financial tools we have with Workday. I know we've talked a lot about Workday over previous times, but maybe just the two of you talk a little bit about the impact on having better data to help us with our financial forecasting.
That's a great question, Kirk. We weren't expecting that. That's a good question. I would say,
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to tee up a
He's not known
softball.
for
Obviously, I didn't do
putting out
that.
good
So
questions.
that felt like a 98-mile-per-hour fastball right there. I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing. It's good. I would say, to be honest, with Workday, there's lots of things we're seeing in the reporting we like already. It is our first year through everything in Workday. So we are doing our first, for example, financial statement compilation for the whole university in a new system, where we had done that in spreadsheets before. And that's amazing. We were really comfortable with those spreadsheets. And now to move to something that's so much more powerful, so much better, is really a big change. And we're working our way through that. So I think probably all of us, candidly, President, are feeling a little bit of that adjustment to having new tools that people recognize can be really powerful. They still feel really different from what we've done with all our spreadsheets in the past. One thing that I think is going to help us as we get further into Workday, I'll give you an example that relates specifically to these auxiliary activities. In our legacy system, auxiliaries couldn't put a budget into the system for their operations. That was all done in shadow spreadsheets. Workday will enable that, and that's going to be really nice over the long term to facilitate a budgeting process where each campus and all units can have all of their funds budgeted in one system, so we can have a plan and then track our progress against that plan.
great recovery. Good job. Yeah, thank you. So for those of you who may not know, Matt's been sort of one of our Workday gurus as we've kind of worked our way through this. So anyway.
Go ahead.
Right.
Regent.
Firstly, thank you. I know it seems like a lot of challenges trying to navigate those different budgeting expectations and not really being sure where things will go. And so thank you for coming and for all of the work that you've done. One question I have, and this is my first meeting, so if I have misunderstood, please help me. I was under the impression when the increased budget or the increased tuition and fees was passed in June, that part of that funding was to support students' mental health services. And I noticed that is one of the principles that you have on where the budget would be focused on student success. And I was wondering if you could just talk to where any of that tuition increase might have been to support that, or if I was mistaken in that understanding as well.
I'll take a shot at that one. I'm not sure I'll be able to fully answer it. So yes, when we considered the tuition rate increase last spring, that was one of the targeted investments that we would do. But one thing you have to remember and be mindful of is that when enrollment declines, that sort of offsets the tuition rate increase. So if you raise tuition, that will generate some more funds. But if we have less students, we might just end up even. But I will see that one of the reinvestments that was made as a result of the budget hearings was to restore some funding for student success initiatives. I can't speak specifically to what those were, but that I'm sure some of our student affairs colleagues could at a future meeting.
Yeah, and we could certainly, Regent, right, we could make that a to-do item for Kelly and I to come back with some of those details about where those reinvestments happened, if that would be helpful.
That was a great question, Regent Ray. And I would also add, in addition to that, perhaps a conversation with student affairs, just in terms of the question was directed around the tuition and the investment in mental health, but I'd like to see it even broader in terms of approach and investment in mental health, regardless of the link to the tuition increase.
Thank you. That's good. We'll make a note of that.
Okay. Thanks. Other questions or comments? We're moving in the right direction, which is great. Thank you both. Appreciate the presentation. And Matt, you're not off the hook. I think you're staying at the table. And joined by Pat Chung, Director of Athletics, and John Harlow for our next presentation on an athletics budget update, which is a very positive update. So with that, much to celebrate, please.
Thank you, Regents. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And I want to reintroduce John Harlow. I think this is your first in person in this room. It's been inside of a year you've been with us, right?
Yes, just at 8 months. So good to see everyone in person and not on the screen for the first time.
So really early in the fiscal year, but I'd be remiss if I didn't publicly thank our students. We have 10,000 student passes, roughly 10,000 student passes out and they've shown up in force, in mass, at soccer, at volleyball, at football. The soccer crowds have been nothing short of amazing. I mean, it is a setting that can only happen at Washington State. Volleyball, by no coincidence, was winless. So they had a tough opening part of their season, but when they came home to Bowler and got welcomed back to really a very unique home court environment, we swept the weekend tournament. And then football, they've just, if we have 10,000 student passes out, it feels like there's 10,000 students there. And this weekend's another great opportunity. So I just want to publicly thank the students for what they've done, you know, in getting their student passes, but also showing up like they've shown up. As of now, no major changes to our FY22 budget. Just want to thank Stacy Pearson and Matt Skinner again for all their hard work. This 50% capacity that we budgeted for in hindsight was pretty fortuitous for us, critical for us. Provided we're expecting our biggest crowd of the year this year. It should get us close to the 50% threshold for the year. I do want to, and we've been pretty public about it this week, we do have labor force challenges inside of our stadium. There will probably be long lines and concessions, long lines to get into the stadium this year, or for this weekend. We're no different than a lot of sports entities in and around the state, but we're communicating with all our ticket holders just to give yourself as much time as possible. And really, there is some uncertainty around the Final Four games. Last week, we announced our masking mandates. By the time we get to the Oregon State game, we'll have a vaccine verification or negative test verification to get into Gisa Field by the time we get to there. So not understand or just forecasting where we think how that may negatively impact attendance. We're fully aware of that, but at least the 50% threshold, I mean, we feel obviously really good. We've been able to hit that. And really going forward, it's just making it through the season and just keep working with Colleen Kerr and Chris Mulick as we go through all these added hurdles to get fans into our stadium. So, John, I don't know if there's anything I missed you want to add. Okay, so that concludes it. Matt, anything you want to add? All right, thank you.
I think the keywords are in the black.
Yeah.
I do have a question, just really quick, Pat. How do you, I serve also as the chair of the board for the Public Facilities District in Spokane. So we too are kind of trying to figure out just the process in which you do the verification. And so any insights to that at this time, or?
No, everything's on the table. We've been partnering and benchmarking with the Mariners, Seahawks, and the Huskies. I had a nice call from Sashi Pillay. We're going to try to figure out how we can partner with IT to make it manageable. He has some technology in place that may help us, but it is going to be a challenge. I know Colleen and her crew have been very communicative with the governor's office that just because of our labor force issues, it's going to be a challenge.
Absolutely.
But we next week is a week we should have a plan. My hope is by the time we get to the middle toward the end of next week that we feel is functional and puts us in at least in a positive situation.
I know one thing just to kind of follow closely is we have the Kraken game in Spokane and had some last minute changes that we've had to work through up there. So it'll be interesting because there are labor shortages there as well. And just lots of meetings on how to do that validation process as people are coming in. So.
Thank you.
Just before Pat sits down, one of the things that we've talked about on campus over the last couple of years has been private fundraising for intercollegiate athletics. Last year, $25 million, or 2 years ago, last year, over $30 million during a COVID time. Just hats off to our athletics folks and going out there, talking to donors and being really focused on some needs. But it's just great to see. It's been a long time coming, but I just want to acknowledge you and your team done a great job with that. It's set an example for the rest of the university and put a fire under the rear ends of some deans and the president to get out there and make sure we're doing the same thing with other places on campus. So well done.
Thanks, Kirk, and thanks to all of our donors as well.
I just want to thank you for your leadership. There's been some rocky moments over the last few months, and you've navigated that very well, and just appreciate your steadfast commitment to WSU and to continuing to lean in the way that we need to right now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Now we're going to move to a future action item, which is a revision to WAC 504-31020, which is conduct on campus code and prohibited conduct. So Matt is going to stay up for this presentation or this discussion and is joined by Bill Gardner. I think if you haven't already taken a look at what's the change, I was surprised to see that we were going to need to actually go through an approvals process and that this wasn't already in our policy. So with that, I will let the two of you take it from here.
Good afternoon, all. This represents some housekeeping. This change brings our WAC concerning fireworks possession on campus in line with our already existing WAC prohibiting fireworks by possession by students. And so it's strictly housekeeping. It was just a word that was not explicitly in that WAC, and we were relying on some other parts of that WAC to cover fireworks, and we thought it would be prudent to add the word fireworks.
Any questions? Pretty straightforward. Again, when I saw it, I thought, gosh, are you kidding me? I would have thought that would have been in there. So yeah, Regent Powell.
The only question I have is why do we have to wait for it to be a future action item as opposed to, because it's a minor but important change?
We actually asked that question, and I'm trying to remember exactly what the answer was, but I think it has to do with the that
we
have to wait to take it next week.
We'll check on Des and I and Danielle and everybody. We'll sort of confer tonight to make sure that's accurate. And if we could do it appropriately tomorrow, we will with the right language. But if we have to wait, that's the reason. So we'll work on that. It's a great. I thought of the same thing. So thank you.
Hearing no other comments, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we are going to transition to action items. There are 4 action items, all of which Matt will be on hand with Olivia Yang. And so, Olivia, do you want to join us here? And Olivia is the Associate Vice President for Facility Services.
Correct. Good afternoon, all. This is actually happy news because we requested these 4 projects, and you saw the requests when you approved them in May of 2020 as part of our state capital budget request. And due to Chris Mulick and Colleen Kerr's good work, we were successful in getting a very good state capital budget, and these 4 projects were funded. I can go into each one in a bit of detail if you want. So the first one is Spokane, and the story behind that is that this is a building that had been previously occupied by Eastern Washington University. They had a new building built for them, and so they moved out of these buildings. At the same time, Spokane had completed a pre-design for a $80 million SIM building, but we said, here's a bird in hand. And if we structure the as an infrastructure project, we would be able to get the money in one biennium instead of waiting for the design construction biennium. And so that's what the campus did. And so we were successful in getting the funding for this project. The second one is actually, it's second and third, Johnson Hall and Clark. So the story on Johnson Hall, and you all may know Johnson, it's the building across the street from French. It's a 200,000 gross square feet building. It's the home of many of the departments in Connors. Connors, as you know, has a long relationship. Well, WSU has a long, almost 100-year relationship with USDA, namely with Connors and with VetMed. So USDA got $105 million in an earlier congressional appropriation to build a building for ARS. And when we met with the ARS folks, we felt that the building should be as planned, located in the Rec Lane Rollins Rec Complex. And when we looked at what was in place in the complex, we thought that really the best site was on the site of Johnson Hall. So we asked for the money to demolish Johnson so that we could put the new building in place. That was not the only advantage, because right now Johnson will cost slightly over $1 million in operations and maintenance money. And so because the feds fund capital but not operating money, it allowed us to offset the operating costs of the new building by using the Johnson money for that. The relationship between Johnson and Clark is that when Rec 5 was done, we moved people out of Clark. This allowed us now to move people from Johnson into Clark, and obviously some people would be moving from Johnson to their new building, but it helped us with the displaced, the homeless people from Johnson. And so that was the connection. Clark is actually 4.9 million, and you recently authorized us to, you recently delegated authority up to 5. But we thought that because of the linkage and because it was, close enough, we thought we'd just come and tell you about it. And the last one is a reservoir in Pullman campus. You know that we have suffered from some lack of investment in our facilities and also in our underground utilities. This water reservoir gives us additional redundancy for our potable water and fire protection system. So I will open for questions if there are any.
So Olivia, can you just speak to, for example, our WSU Spokane Phase 1 building, timing-wise, what that looks like, as well as then Johnson and Clark?
So on Spokane, we would, you may know that in the last 10 years, we have been using extensively the procurement method called design build. So this allows us to move forward quickly. And so we intend to award a design build contract shortly after, well, assuming you approve all this, we will award a design build contract and get moving, and hopefully, not quite in 2 years, but just a hair over the 2 years, we hope to have this all completed. It is essentially if you imagine the landlord and tenant improvement aspects, this is supposed to be mostly landlord. And then we would, and it's mostly the building outside and cores that we need to renovate. And so that's primarily the work that we'll be doing. So Johnson, so you might know that USDA/ARS has hired the Army Corps of Engineers to be their project manager. We were then retained to be the ARS on-site quality control. Basically, we are their rep, their local rep. And so because of our experience in Rec 5 and the familiarity people have with us and us with them, that worked out really well. So we are working with USDA and the Corps of Engineers on their pre-design. The federal pre-design model, of course, is not quite as streamlined as ours. So they go through almost, if you know I'm sorry if I'm being a public works geek here, they have this thing called bridging, where the owner does a 35% drawing and then they go out to design build. And so we are getting close to completing the 35% bridging documents with their architect. Once that is done, then we would go out for a design build with a design builder and all that. And we're looking at completing this in 22. And the significance there is that, in fact, it is Clark that needs to be fixed up first, so that before we can demolish Johnson, we have places for people to go. And Clark is the biggest home for the people that are being displaced. Obviously, we want the permanent home to be Clark. Those who are temporarily displaced from Johnson will be housed every which way, everywhere we can, until the new ARS building is done, and then we can move them in there. Does that help?
Are there any other questions, comments? This is, yeah. Sorry.
I appreciate Olivia always comes to the Regents and talks about this stuff, but rarely does she talk about the great job her team does. They deliver buildings on time, under budget, and she does a great job of working with all these contractors and stuff like that. So, you know, we don't have cost overruns. Those are always, her team just does a great job of that. So, Olivia, thank you. You don't take enough credit for the great job you all do, and you deserve a lot of kudos for keeping us moving forward and helping to think a little differently about how we do our physical plan. So thank you.
Thank you, but it's really your facilities team that is doing all the work. I'm just a girl with ideas.
And we knew you'd say that. So anyway, tough. Yeah, well done.
Are there any other questions or comments? So this is a future action, or this is an action item for tomorrow. So we will take action tomorrow on these 4 elements. In addition to thanking you, Olivia, for your leadership in this space and helping us to understand how this is coming to fruition. I do want to do a shout out. You know, state capital budgets require planning and collaboration. And so a big thank you to Colleen Kerr and Chris Mulick. This is a team effort. And so bringing the money and making the facilities happen all happens together. So thank you, everyone that's involved in this effort. There's no other comments or questions. This might be a record. So some positive news from the Finance Committee, and we're sending it back to you, Chair Dickinson.
I know that's what people are saying about the chair too right now. You like talk about a softball. Okay. Thank you very much. So what a great day. So many great reports today. Thank you very much for a really well outlined agenda. We will be now going into executive session to discuss some legal counsel litigation or potential litigation in which the university is or could be a party. The session will be closed. The executive session will conclude at approximately 4:30 unless it's extended by further announcement. If any action is taken as a result of these discussions, it will be taken tomorrow during open session. We will immediately following the executive session, we will come back, but we will be adjourning the meeting. So for those of you who would prefer to buy back an hour of your day, we will be adjourning immediately after executive session. We won't be going into any other agenda items. So thank you everybody who was a guest today, and just appreciate your reports. Yes, and we, Regents, let's come back at 3:55 here, so just about 10 minutes.